You need to know that Mark Mazzetti wrote this book here. Of course, it's the first thing I would tell you. He's going to tell you, too. Even more interesting than the fact that he wrote it here, he was here, or it was while he was here, that Max Mazzetti was born. We're a full-service place. We handle books, families, personal lives. So we're very proud of the fact that Max Mazzetti is the youngest ever Wilson Center Fellow. Last week, I gave a lecture at Penn Law School entitled The Extrajudicial Use of Drones, the Need for a New Post-9/11 Legal Framework. In my view, we're getting a lot of the tactics right, but we have no overall strategy, which means in the end that we're losing the narrative or the argument. This book, written at the Wilson Center by Mark Mazzetti, frames that dilemma very well. And my answer to that, and obviously Mark and Rob Litvak are very able national security expert and vice president for scholars who will question him. We'll get into this, but my answer for that is Congress. I know that's a very strange thing to put on the table, but I think Congress has to own this game. Congress used to own this game. That's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was written in 1978 at a time when I was a little kid working in the Carter White House in response to abuses by the executive and challenges that we faced then. And I think Congress in this game would, in my view, fix a lot of our problems. Just a couple other things to point out. John Brennan, in his role as White House counterterrorism czar, he's now CIA director, came to the Wilson Center at his request last year to give the Obama administration's first public explanation of how the U.S. decides when to use drones for certain operations. And he didn't give the operational details, but he gave the basic outlines of what the drone program was. And I thought it was important that he came here to talk about it. And he took questions after. Some of you may have been there. In my view, and I say this as someone who, as I said, worked on these issues in Congress, but also now still holds advisory roles to each of the agencies. I think the CIA is tied down in the paramilitary mission. It requires people on the ground in order to target drones accurately, and focusing on that mission prevents the CIA from seeing around corners and figuring out what's next going to happen. I think, and I've said this publicly, that mission should shift back to DOD. At any rate, we'll discuss that in a moment. Let me just give you some background on Mark Mazzetti and Rob Litvak. Mark is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's a native Washingtonian. He's reported on defense and national security for many publications, including The Economist, U.S. News and World Report, the Los Angeles Times, required reading in my old congressional district. Since joining the New York Times in 2006, he's been the recipient of several major journalism awards, including a Pulitzer for his reporting on the rising violence in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Washington's response. He's also a Pulitzer finalist the previous year for his coverage of the CIA's detention and interrogation program, something, again, I lived or knew about up close and personal. In late 2007, he broke the story of the CIA's destruction of the interrogation videotapes, something I urged not happen. Not the story, but the destruction. His story launched a Justice Department investigation into the episode, and he won the Livingston Prize for national reporting for his work. And I won nothing for my warning. I like to call the Wilson Center an intellectual candy store, and we provide talented reporters and writers like Mark with the space and support to do really deep dives into some of the toughest issues. In his acknowledgement in the book, Mark said the Wilson Center gave him, quote, a professional home, fascinating and supportive colleagues, and access to a vast library run by a crack team, unquote. He also called Wilson, quote, the best research institution in Washington. He and I are completely unbiased in saying that. It was a real privilege to have him here for 15 months. He got an extension. And this book is exactly the type of timely and policy-relevant work we aim to produce. Rob Litvak is our Vice President for Scholars and our Director of International Security Studies. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown and a consultant to the Los Alamos National Lab. During the first Clinton administration, he served as the on the NSC staff as Director for Nonproliferation. He has written a recent book, Outlier States, American Strategies to Change, Contain, and Engage Regimes, and which was the subject of one of our national conversations with Tom Friedman, who wrote his book, From Beirut to Jerusalem Here, and NPR's Steve Inskeep, which we hosted last summer. If you still haven't read it, be sure to buy a copy. So on that note, welcome back to the Wilson Center. This fascinating conversation begins right now.
Thank you very much, Jane. Jane referred to the Wilson Center as an intellectual candy store, and for those of us privileged to work on the staff, one of the great features of the Wilson Center are just the marvelous residential scholars who rotate through here, and it was marvelous to have Mark with us for an extended period to work on this book, which is a first cut of history of the war of terrorism in the last decade, and with the historical context that precedes it, it's a must-read. And copies are available for purchase and signing by the author when this is over. The Way of the Knife, the CIA, a Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa programs for their role in organizing today's meeting. The format is going to be conversational style. Mark and I will, I'll pose some questions to Mark to kind of draw out the main themes of the book for 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions from the floor. So Mark, let me just go to the obvious jump-off point in kind of framing the discussion in your book. It's a history of a tale of two organizations, as Jane alluded to in her opening remarks, how the CIA got into the paramilitary business, and in turn how the military developed its own espionage capability. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, just after 9/11, said he had to make the Pentagon more like the CIA. Take us through that evolution. I mean, how these two organizations that had two different tracks, how they evolved in this way, each kind of encroaching, so to speak, on the turf of the other.
Sure, and I would like to start by saying thank you to Jane, thank you to Mike Van Duzen, thank you to Rob, thank you to everyone at Wilson for giving me this opportunity, not today, but to actually be here as a scholar. It was a tremendous time in the candy store, and this book wouldn't have been possible if I had not been able to be here. There's just a couple other people I want to mention. The book would not have at all have been possible without the two people who are sitting in the third row, Adam Ahmed and Jessica Schulberg, who were my research assistants and absolutely terrific and integral parts of the effort. And then two people who actually, it really wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for them. My parents are here. So thank you for coming down. Anyway, I really enjoyed myself here, and so thanks for having me back. The story is, if you were to begin on 9/11, you would find that the Pentagon was this still Cold War institution that was ill-equipped to fight this kind of new war. And Rumsfeld sees this and is infuriated that, I mean, on one hand, that the CIA gets into Afghanistan before the military does, but more broadly that there are the authorities in place where, the soldiers can't go into certain types of countries, and that he thought his mission was restricted and overly reliant on the CIA. So he has to sort of turn the soldiers more into spies. The CIA, on the other hand, was involved in the Al-Qaeda hunt, but there is this sort of morality play going on pre-9/11 in the CIA about the use of the Predator, about whether to kill bin Laden, and you had a generation of CIA officers who had come into the CIA after the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s, which pretty much probably everyone in this audience knows, revealed all of these operations that the CIA had done a coup attempts, assassination plots, aired a lot of the CIA's dirty laundry. And so people got into the CIA in many cases saying, you know, we're not in the killing business, we're in the spying business. So then 9/11 happens, and a lot of those concerns are swept away. And so what you see is an evolution within the CIA since 9/11. You know, increasingly towards this manhunting and killing. That is the mission that two successive presidents have given the CIA. A conservative Democrat and conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat have both basically made this the CIA's primary mission. And so it has evolved, and it was more in the first few years a real capture mission, as we know and as Jane talked about, interrogation, detention. But partly because of the fallout of what happened there, they got very much more into the targeted killing mission, which is where we see it today.
Okay. Elaborate a little bit on, in practice, how did this overlap and division of labor and missions, how did it work both practically and legally? You use a phrase that special operations forces were sheep-dipped in order to allow them to perform functions in certain countries. That metaphor, could you unpack it? Because I think it really gets to the heart of the sort of the jurisdictional and functional issues that you get at in the book.
So this first period, several years after 9/11, you have a you know, the Pentagon increasingly is trying to get into this game. The CIA is there, and there's a lot of tripping over each other, of the soldiers and the spies, and Rumsfeld had sent teams to work both in embassies overseas and outside of embassies to gather intelligence, and the term was, you know, preparation of the battlefield. So if the world is a battlefield, then soldiers can go anywhere, and so there were these instances where you know, one of these teams got into a bar fight in Paraguay, and a guy shot someone, and they had to be spirited out of the country very quickly. And there were things that were done without the knowledge of the CIA station chief. So it got pretty bad. And so around 2005 and 2006, they reached this sort of a détente where they got together and they said that we need to work out rules of how to, you know, who's in charge in which places. So they kind of made it country specific. In Pakistan, the CIA was in charge. If there were any military operations cross-border into Pakistan, they were done under CIA authority.
So the SEALs were made spies for a night.
The SEALs were made spies for a night, and so sheep dipping is a sort of colorful term for a bureaucratic thing, which is basically you're put under CIA authority, you're spies for the day. And you know, the most famous example of this, of course, is several years later, in May of 2011, when the Navy SEALs go into Pakistan, deep into Pakistan, kill Osama bin Laden, and the entire time they are under CIA authority. Technically, Leon Panetta, the CIA director, has control of the whole operation.
These two titles, 10 and 50,
right,
under which they operate, and I know Jane Harman, who's been calling for the institution of kind of a rule of law overseeing the war on terror, and sort of working out sort of how in practice these titles, the legal authorizations line up with kind of the functionality issues. And I know the 9/11 Commission came out, one of the recommendations was to get the CIA out of the paramilitary issue. And this is sort of a kind of a work in progress, this tale of two organizations. We'll get to the future, kind of where we're at and where we're going in the future. Unless you have something to add on particularly.
No, I just you brought up the 9/11 Commission, and it was very quickly. I mean, that was actually one of the very few recommendations of the 9/11 Commission that was not followed, which was take the paramilitary function out of the CIA, and for various reasons, which I discussed in the book. You know, it didn't happen, and the CIA wanted to protect it, and even Rumsfeld went along with them preserving it because I think he realized there were some functions that CIA did that he didn't want to do himself.
Let me pick up on a point you mentioned, but I think focuses us on what, for many Americans sort of reading the newspaper, is become the most visible aspect. Well, it's invisible, but visible in terms of stories like your one on the A1 of the New York Times last Sunday, the targeted killings and the use of drones. And you alluded to the Church Committee in the 1970s, where there had been an executive, which resulted in an executive order outlawing, proscribing assassination. And then as the threat changes and the emergence in the 1990s of Osama bin Laden, there was a debate in the Clinton administration over whether they could target Osama bin Laden specifically. And that debate, which played out in a pre-9/11 context, sort of shifted post-9/11. Could you just take us through that policy arc of how the debate on kind of targeted killings kind of went from the church committee, in the 70s to where we're at right now, where
well, it's interesting. And the 9/11 Commission report gets into some of this, that you have these deep divisions in the CIA about whether they should be in the killing business. Get back to assassination, specifically with bin Laden, specifically with al-Qaeda. You had a core group of people inside the CIA's counterterrorism center, which has been running basically the CIA's war, which around that time was this small, somewhat fringe part of the CIA that was staffed by some very devoted, committed people. Cofer Black was the head of the counterterrorism center at the time, and they were pushing hard for the authority to kill bin Laden. Pushing for the predator. And there were others in the CIA, including James Pavitt, who was the head of the clandestine service. And for those who don't know, basically the clandestine service used to be called the Directorate of Operations, and it's basically the part of the CIA that does all the spying and the covert action. And Pavitt really was concerned about whether they should be getting into this, back into the killing. And so there's these fights inside the CIA, and they go to the White House, and you have a lot of these very forceful personalities in the White House, with Richard Clarke, who is the counterterrorism advisor, and you have Sandy Berger, the national security advisor, and there are these debates about, well, okay, if you can shoot Tomahawk missiles, which they did in 1998 after the U.S. embassies were attacked to try to kill bin Laden, why can't you use a predator? Like, what is the difference? And so it became sometimes abstract, sometimes very, very specific. But and as the 9/11 Commission report shows, basically right up to 9/11, they were having these meetings about whether they should deploy the Predator to Afghanistan to kill bin Laden. And then the rest is history, because the 9/11 happens, and all of these sort of concerns among the senior staff in the CIA about getting back into the killing business, were quickly swept aside.
Well, let me pick up on two consequences that I think flow from that. The first is how it has affected the CIA, and you talk about how the agency was experiencing the downside of its reorientation to counterterrorism. That is, that the counterterrorism mission was being pursued at the expense of traditional traditional intelligence functions. And as kind of evidence of that, some point to failure to see the Arab Spring coming. To what extent do you see that as a sort of a fair critique?
I think that there was certainly. I think it would be unfair to say that the CIA should have predicted that a person in Tunisia was going to set himself on fire, and that this would be the spark that lit the fire. That's an unfair critique. But there was a lot of concern at the White House during the Arab Spring, when you had these cascading revolutions in Tunisia and then Egypt and Libya and elsewhere, in Yemen. And the feeling was that the agency was behind the curve, that they were not up to, able to say, okay, this is what's happening, this is what we think is going to happen, and that and John Brennan, interestingly, in his most recent confirmation hearing, in his answers to questions to the Senate Intelligence Committee, said that. He said it more diplomatically, but he basically was asked a question about the Arab Spring, and he said, well, I think the CIA can do better in a lot of places. And so it was him as much acknowledging that there's a cost to this. Now, the other interesting point, I think, on this is that when you do counterterrorism, you're necessarily going to be working with the spy services of foreign countries very closely, Egypt, Libya, and you do, and so you're working with foreign spy agencies in order to hunt down Al-Qaeda or affiliated groups. But these services are not going to be the ones who are going to tell the CIA, oh, by the way, there's a revolt that's brewing in the streets, and our regime is pretty fragile. So you have a trade-off by being so close to the foreign liaison services and not necessarily having maybe your ear to the ground about what's happening in these countries.
Mm-hmm. I think a second type of consequence, I mean, the first you've just touched on, a sort of kind of institutional mission, and whether it was whether the paramilitary aspect was an important complement to what they'd been doing, or kind of in part diverted them from their core mission. The second type of consequence would fall under the rubric of kind of blowback, and you know, the metaphor of the book is the way of the knife, your writing and your reporting brings out that some of these operations were not so surgical, and there was collateral damage. A British diplomat, you know, has privately, you know, expressed concern that some of the U.S. You know, drone missions in Pakistan we were reaching sort of a tipping point. I mean, Rumsfeld famously said, "Are we killing more bad guys than we're creating?" That we were reaching a tipping point where the kind of the ill will and animus created was kind of in utility terms greater than the positive gain of taking someone off the battlefield. And this British diplomat was concerned about possible blowback into Britain itself, given their kind of homegrown population there. And one reads in your newspaper that the total number of drone strikes is down in the last year or two. Could you just link these, connect these dots, so to speak, and you know, does that declining number reflect? Is it a function of there are fewer targets on the battlefield because of the success of the program? Is it a recognition that there are this potential blowback consequences, or kind of all of the above?
Well, on the blowback issue, it's an important point. People are talking about it, and they're starting to. It's hard to assess at this point. I think it's still ongoing to know, you know, what is the impact of targeted killings. What impact are they having? I mean, you get anecdotal evidence. I mean, for instance, in May 2010, when Faisal Shahzad, who was an American who tried to blow up a truck in Times Square, was brought into court, and he says, you know, the reason I did this was because of the drone strikes in Pakistan. Now, that's one example, and it's difficult to know. You know, there's certainly anger in parts of certainly Pakistan, Yemen, the places where they're happening, and will it have a sort of boomerang effect? I think we'll see. And then, sorry, the second part was on. The second part of your question, after the blowback, was the
question of the decline in number of drone strikes, and whether that's like there are just fewer targets. That, you know, President Obama in the campaign said, "Look, we've really decimated Al Qaeda, and they're kind of off the battlefield." Is it that, or recognition of declining kind of utility?
Well,
in terms of the political.
I think it's some of both. I mean, the real surge of strikes happens in you know, from the 2008 to 2010 period, and that's in Pakistan. Now that's in Pakistan, and then it's been declining. At the same time, the strikes in Yemen have gone up significantly. I think it's partly that you know, the core Al Qaeda group, certainly as it existed on 9/11, and even as it existed a couple years ago, a lot of those guys are dead. But you're seeing, and there's been also some reporting about this by McClatchy, very good reporting the last couple of days, about you know, who's getting killed, and it's the members of the Haqqani Network, which is a militant organization primarily focused in North Waziristan, which is carries out attacks into Afghanistan, and so that's sort of the CIA's running the other half of the Afghan war. They're just doing it from the Pakistan side. There are strikes that kill Pakistani Taliban, which are carry out attacks inside of Pakistan. So it's there are fewer strikes, but they're also different. The targets are different, and so. You know, in Yemen, I mean, it's, again, this is another interesting point of this. You could either call it redundancy, you could call it convergence, you could call it a lot of things, but you have a drone war, a CIA drone war in Yemen, you have a Pentagon drone war in Yemen. They both have different target lists. They both you know, do their own operations, and you know, so there has been some speculation and some criticism that, you know, is the U.S. just the sort of counterinsurgency air force for Yemen by doing these drone strikes? Are they killing Al Qaeda members who are looking to plot against the United States, or is this an internal fight that we've gotten ourselves into? And so these are some of the questions I think that are getting asked.
Your book kind of brilliantly deals with the other countries that figure in the kind of war on terrorism outside of Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course Pakistan is central to this this narrative. Pakistan, I mean, after 9/11, there was great emphasis on the nexus of proliferation of terrorism. If you had to focus on one country that is kind of epitomizes that nexus, it would be Pakistan. Talk about the evolution of the U.S.-Pakistani relationship between this period, how an agreement between Pakistan and the United States was crafted that would allow for American kind of employment of drones over Pakistani airspace. And then you touched on kind of related in terms of the U.S.-Pakistani relationship. You mentioned the Haqqani network, and yet kind of the tension in Pakistani policy in terms of kind of toleration of terrorist groups and targeting of terrorist groups. I mean, indeed, it's been a victim of terrorism. But you allude to Admiral Mullen's eventual impatience with dealing with his counterpart on the terrorism issue.
I spend a lot of time in the book sort of tracing the arc of this relationship, which I think is probably the most important. It's certainly the most interesting, I think, relationship the U.S. has had since 9/11, because Pakistan is such an important country, and then in the microcosm, it's the CIA-ISI relationship, which is really became very toxic, but started out pretty good. I quote when I was in Pakistan last summer, I interviewed a man who was the ISI station chief in Peshawar, a man named Asad Munir, who speaks very fondly about his time working with the CIA, and they were hunting down Al-Qaeda operatives around Peshawar and elsewhere, and was very saddened by what had happened. And I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why sort of everything went downhill. The deal you alluded to was in 2004. I decided to excerpt it in the Times, and I spent a chapter in the book talking about it because I think it's very interesting. It's the first drone strike in Pakistan, the U.S. drone strike in Pakistan, where the U.S. had been pushing to get in, to get armed drone flights, but it didn't. But President Musharraf didn't allow it. And at the same time, there was this tribal rebellion going on in South Waziristan, led by a man named Nek Mohammed, who was causing incredible amounts of problems for the Pakistani military. And he had also been facilitating Al-Qaeda members, helping them come over the border into Pakistan from Afghanistan. And so it wasn't that he was not the U.S.'s problem, but he was a far greater problem for Pakistan. And so he was the first person who was killed, and a deal was brokered about the drone flights. I won't spend too much time on this relationship because we could spend hours on it, but then you have the unraveling, and the unraveling happens over time for all sorts of different reasons. One thing I focus on very in great detail is the Raymond Davis episode. And very quickly, for those who don't know, Raymond Davis was a CIA contractor who was a former Green Beret and hired by the CIA, and was in late January 2011 driving through the streets of Lahore he was part of a CIA team in Lahore, and kills two men who had approached him, he said, with guns. He tries to get help from the U.S. consulate. A car shows up, drives down the wrong side of the street, kills a third person, drives away. Raymond Davis is all of a sudden in jail, and the U.S. government tries to get him out. And I sort of spend time talking about the fights inside the U.S. government about how to deal with the situation. And the reason I spend so much time talking about it is because when you go to Pakistan, I mean, the Raymond Davis episode is sort of forgotten in the United States. It's the Bin Laden raid happened a couple months later, and that's basically what people remember. But when you go to Pakistan, and I mean that's what you hear about. I mean Raymond Davis is sort of a boogeyman who is, you know, he's just a sort of even a caricature saying, you know, the Raymond Davises running around, and that's what people talk about, and it sort of confirmed many people's conspiracy theories, many people's suspicions that, you know, the CIA had deployed this whole secret army inside Pakistan. So that's the sort of relationship in a nutshell. And, you know, has it gotten back on a better footing than it was in 2011? Maybe, but I think certainly so much has been damaged that the trust is not going to be there for a while.
Before opening it up for comments and questions from the floor, let me ask one last question. As a reporter, you know, the obvious question, where does the story go from here? You now have John Brennan, who gave a speech here that Jane alluded to in her opening remarks, where he laid out, it was the first, maybe the only really high-profile public statement on the drone program. He's identified with the episodes you deal with extensively in the book. He's now at the CIA at a time when it's widely viewed that the CIA is wanting to get out of the paramilitary business for kind of a host of reasons that you mentioned. You have Secretary Hagel of the Defense Department, whose attitude on these issues is uncertain, but it seems that is the next phase of the story going to be how the CIA gets out of the paramilitary business, in turn how the DoD gets out of the espionage business. And I know we've been fortunate this year to have an Air Force fellow, Wolf Davidson, who's here, that some of these demarcations are not as neat and easy to make as kind of an org chart would say, that to conduct special operations you need the intelligence. You're either getting it from the intelligence community, a lot of it's quite kind of specific and tactical, or else you're generating it yourself. So in practice, the kind of the bumper sticker, CIA out of paramilitary, DoD out of espionage, that may be in practical terms, given the character of the threat environment out there, easier to say than to really kind of negotiate.
Yeah, I mean, you're right.
There's a question mark at the end of that.
Right. No, I got that. I mean, it's because I agree with you. I think that it's you know, Brennan has alluded to wanting to give up some of these missions, that he thinks that sort of too much has been lost by so much focus on paramilitary operations. As you said, he was intimately involved in the drone program for the last 4 years from his job at the White House. I think that, so I think some of that will happen. I think that it would be surprising to me if the CIA gave it up anytime soon. I think that the CIA would want to retain the option to doing strikes in a number of places. I think the idea of taking it away from a covert action authority and being more public about it, I mean, again, as you said, is easier said than done in places like Pakistan. Is that going to be something that the Pakistani government will allow? Is it something that, I mean, will the Pakistani government continue to allow strikes, period? So if it's something that happens, I think it'll be years. And then you have the whole issue of, you know, if you've listed so far to one side, you've trained generation of officers who are sort of they know manhunting and killing, and you have to, if you retrain them, it takes a long time to get sort of people classically trained in the sort of classic espionage stuff. So Brennan's got his work cut out for him if this is something he indeed wants to do. In terms of on the Pentagon side, you know, so much, they've gone so far down the road of with the authorities where the military can go places where they couldn't go, and the budgets are so much bigger, at least for special operations. I think that a lot of that is set, and I don't see a lot of that getting unwound. Admiral McCraven, who is the head of Special Operations Command, has basically indicated that, you know, he wants to, you know, make this a global command in the sense that Rumsfeld wanted it to be a decade ago, you know, more than a decade ago, and so there's a constituency for that. And then just finally, the issue of where it goes. I mean, then it gets to the issue of transparency and accountability. And you know, it is amazing that, I mean, as Jane pointed out, how much this is now really just being discussed. And as a reporter, when we were covering the Brennan confirmation hearing, and the Senate Intelligence Committee, says that, well, we don't even have the legal memos that justify the targeted killings, and these are the senators who have the highest level of classification, who more than their other colleagues do, and are supposed to have oversight, and they don't even have the memos, and so it's really striking. And so in his State of the Union address, President Obama said that an era of transparency is coming, and an era of accountability is coming, and I guess we'll see.
Great. Just would note that Admiral McRaven will be speaking at the Wilson Center on, I believe it's May 2nd, and in one of Jane Harman's signature kind of national conversations, and we'll get more, even further have a further in-depth discussion of these issues. I also noted that in today's paper that the special operations, Wolf, you may be pleased to say, I think they got their full budget in the Pentagon. They weren't cut like other parts of it, which I think is a reflection of how high their stock is in the Pentagon, but also in the White House and OMB. So with that, I think we've laid out kind of a menu of issues here and gotten to many of the kind of the main ones you address in this marvelous book. So let me open it up now for comments and questions on the floor. Jane, hang on, there's a microphone coming to you. Here it is. Josh, go ahead.
Thank you both. Absolutely fascinating. And yes, Bill McRaven is coming here on May 2nd. We don't have to pursue now. There's no time. The need, which I believe there is, for a legal framework legislated by Congress around all this. Remember, these OLC memos that Congress wanted access to were written by the executive branch for the executive branch. They are not law, and that's a whole issue. But Mark, I just wanted to raise the context going forward. The U.S. doesn't own the drone program. Other countries, 70 countries, either have or are developing drones. Some of the countries, not many yet, have weaponized drones. And there are no rules of the road internationally. We don't have the luxury very long of trying to get this right and putting all this in the right department. It could happen sooner rather than later that pick a place around the world, somebody else's drones are dwelling over a target and launching weapons. Have you thought about this? And as a reporter, how do you think about this?
I do, and I get into some of this issue of where do we go from here in the book. And there's a man in the front row who's writing a book about the Predator, Rick Whittle, who will, I know, get into these issues very deeply as well in his book. But it's no longer, we don't have a monopoly on this. In other countries, the Israelis were really the first to develop unmanned systems and do these kinds of operations. We're going to reach a point where there are countries that are going to be using these drones that in ways that we don't like, but are very similar to the way that we use them. So what will be our what will be the U.S.'s sort of moral standing to say no if the Russians were, for instance, to use drones in Georgia, and they'd say they're defending themselves, and that's been the U.S. position. And then the future of warfare, if you really want to spin it out, it will be drones fighting drones, and that I'm not an expert on, but it's certainly where we're going, and as Rob said, the budgets, in an era of shrinking defense budgets, drones and special operations are a lot more cost effective than a carrier battle group. So that's, I think, the way things are going. Your point on what are the rules? One of the things that's interesting is that the administration is trying to, we're told, develop what they call this playbook, like the rules of the road for when you can use targeted killings. And I should actually say, drone is a weapon, right? What we're talking about is targeted killings, and how they're done is less important than the fact that they're being done. So how to do them, where to do them, when you can do them, what is the threshold. And my colleague Scott Shane had a terrific story last fall where he said, where he talked about how, in the frantic days before the election in November, when it was, there was a lot of nervousness in the White House that, they might lose and that President Romney would have this authority, they were frantically writing the rules to try to get authorities in place to hand to Romney. And then Obama won and the sort of heat came off and now they're still working on it. So it sort of does show to some degree how much this is being kind of made up as they go along, and that there is not a framework in place legally, operationally, and it'll, and so we'll have to keep following that.
Okay. Let's go to Bob Hathaway in the front row.
Thanks, Rob. Welcome back, Mark. You talked about Pentagon, CIA, White House. There's another agency, department in this town that's supposed to have something to do with foreign policy.
Which one's
your
that?
Story, well, I'll ask you, but your story on Raymond Davis a day or two ago described a very, very tense confrontation in an NSC meeting between Secretary of State and Leon Panetta. Has the State Department simply been rolled in this whole process? It's difficult to imagine Hillary Clinton or Dick Holbrooke sort of being patsies, but it appears like they're non-players. What role have they had in this?
Just to kind of sharpen the question even further, there's discussion in the book between Secretaries Panetta and Clinton over what the DoD had to tell missions in countries in which these operations are occurring.
Right. So there is intense concern in the State Department, and has been for some years, of basically U.S. foreign policy has been militarized, and that the ambassadors no longer have the real clout in the country because the combatant commander does, or something like that. So the episode you're referring to in the book, and I excerpted in the magazine, is where the ambassador in Pakistan, Cameron Munter, is feeling as if basically the CIA is entirely running the show, that the CIA is running foreign policy in Pakistan. And he wasn't against the drone program, but he thought that the CIA was being reckless in its use of strikes. He thought that that there was no sort of assessment of the consequences of some of these strikes, and the timing was terrible. For instance, one of them, one of the most controversial ones, takes place the day after Raymond Davis was released from prison, and it was this very controversial strike that, by most accounts, killed a lot of people who were not militants. And the CIA still defends that strike, but very few other people do. And so Munter starts saying that he needs veto power over these missions, to say, when it's proposed, we're going to do the strike, to say, no, you can't do it today because this is what's happening, the timing is bad. So it escalates, and he's having these fights with the CIA station chief in Islamabad in the summer of 2011. This is about a month after the Bin Laden raid, and there's a screaming match where he says, Munter yells, you're not the ambassador, and the CIA chief says, I don't want to be the ambassador, and the idea being that I got more power. And so then it escalates to Washington, and Hillary Clinton starts defending Munter and defending his idea of the idea of veto power, and ultimately, and then Panetta, her and Panetta get into a heated exchange. Ultimately, what's brokered is Munter gets a little bit of authority, but really the CIA wins the battle. So there's no question that, Hillary Clinton was no shrinking violet, and she was a powerful figure in the administration. But I think that, and certainly supportive, as best I can tell, of a lot of the counterterrorism operations that were going on. But certainly individual ambassadors started to feel that that they didn't really have control over the country where they were supposed to be having control over.
Yeah. We'll go, this is Samuel Khan. And if everyone could just identify themselves. Thank you. Yeah.
This is Simbul Khan, Pakistan scholar here at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Mark. I'm really looking forward to your book, and I hope that part of my work is made easier, and I can probably just lift pieces out of your book and add to my thing. Just one short question about the whole drones and Pakistan. And there's an argument that you refer to, and probably a lot of people have heard about this. CIA versus the drone program in Pakistan, if it was under the control of, say, special forces or the military. And there have been people in the special forces who have said that it would have been better if they were running the program. And do you feel, and there are questions about some of the targeting, as you've mentioned, the target selection, and how especially that target selection was expanded to signature strikes and force protection strikes, and CIA is still running that program. Do you think if this was handed over to the special forces and to the military authorities in Afghanistan, and as we've seen, a lot of it became an extension of the Afghan war into Fatah. Do you think there would have been more opacity in that, or do you think it would have worked better than how it has worked out?
The CIA basically likes to say that they become really good at this, right? That they're better than the military at doing these kinds of operations. And that, and there have been, several. If you look at Yemen, there have been some some strikes in Yemen that were conducted by the military that didn't go well at all. And it is not much easier getting information out of the Pentagon on this stuff than it is the CIA. So the question is, will it be more transparent if it will be to move to the military? Not necessarily. Just because it is not under a covert action authority doesn't mean that the United States has to every day come out and say what just happened, we did the strike on this day and that's the reason. Now, I should say there are many people in the U.S. government who believe that, and the State Department also, who think that the worst thing that can happen is that this stuff all stays in secret, right? If they could come out and defend these strikes more, they could respond to some of the criticism and what they view as propaganda about the program and about civilian casualties. Now, there's no question that there have been civilian casualties in many cases, but I think that also and even people who study this issue tend to think that the civilian casualties have gone down in these strikes. So, I think the question is if, and then the second part of it is, if it were to go to the Pentagon, what would Pakistan's government response be? Would it be more public, and would the Pakistani government want it to be more public? This is such an immediate issue right now in Pakistan's government because of this question of, do they support it? Do they know? Does parts of the government support it? Others don't. So that's why, in answer to Rob's question, the question was, is the CIA going to give this up? I think for Pakistan, my own prediction is that it will stay in CIA hands for the immediate future.
Mm-hmm. Right there, Josh, how about you?
Thank you. Hi, Julie Rashadi, a reporter with Roll Call. Thank you for having us here today. You mentioned briefly that, to my understanding, the CIA kind of was blindsided by the Arab Spring uprisings, kind of as a result of being in communication with government liaisons, but not having their ear to the ground to kind of be aware of populist or popular uprisings of that sort. That struck me as nearly identical to what took place in 1979 in Iran, which led to what we have today in that country. So I guess the question that it prompts is, can a bureaucracy really accurately respond to the dynamism of forces they can't control, especially bottom-up movements that are basically the antithesis to such an organization? I wonder if your research has given you any sense of that.
Well, the CIA was founded, basically was founded to be able to provide warning to the president about what's going to happen in the world, right? And go out, gather intelligence, get people to spy on their own governments and get those secrets and then analyze them. Predictive. Now, they've always had a covert action function, so I shouldn't say that this is paramilitary activities in the CIA are not a new thing. But your question about certainly on Iran in 1979 or Iran in 2013 or North Korea in 2013 is, these places that are very hard to penetrate, is the CIA doing a good enough job? Now, the CIA gets beaten up on a lot of things, and in their defense, they would say we're still a relatively small organization, and the president told us our number one mission is counterterrorism. So that's what we're doing, and now, and there's necessarily going to be opportunity cost. So your question about the dynamism, the Arab Spring was an example of a very fast-moving change. So, and I'll give you an anecdote, and I put it in the book, is that the Arab Spring's playing out on Facebook and on Twitter, and Panetta is sitting in one of these staff meetings, and he's just sort of, it was sort of like, how do we get a handle on Twitter? Is there one place where it's all like housed and we can find out, and Facebook, and so it showed not that no one in the CIA knew how to use Twitter, but it was just this idea of something playing out so quickly. It wasn't even like the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It was something that happening in even faster in many ways, and the CIA had trouble catching up to that. So and I've talked to CIA officials who have said, I'd like to be getting, it would be good for us to be getting into different missions. I'd like to be doing something else. But this has been our number one priority. 2 presidents have given it to us, and there are going to be trade-offs.
Okay. Gentleman here in the front row. Got a few more minutes left. We'll get a few more questions in.
My name's Okab Malik. I'm an assistant professor at National Defence University, Islamabad. I'm recently here as a SAIS fellow. And whilst I've been here, I've been considering a lot of things concerning this. I'm doing my own writing, my own subject. But I've been in Pakistan for the last 4.5 years. I came from England over there. And I witnessed a lot of heartache, headache, and a lot of angst amongst the people. And you probably witnessed that also yourself. And when it comes down to perceptions of people and the negativity that they portray, especially in the polls that you hear from over in the States, and Pakistan is no longer a friend, etc., etc. A lot of people ask me about that when I tell them what my origins are. Doesn't always bode well for me.
We're down to 7% approval, so go ahead.
But I think working in a military institution, working with the Ministry of Defence in Islamabad, teaching and talking and conversing with the inner circles within the military, and I teach at higher levels with brigadier generals as my students as well, and American Special Forces officers. I found out that generally amongst the military, especially after Osama was killed, people felt, or the military officers, and a lot of public felt dismayed extensively. They felt certain, and we've heard this term again and again, red lines were crossed again and again, and this was the last one, then Sehala.
Right.
Problem is, has that had any impact in operationalization as far as CIA is concerned? Mm-hmm. And does that play an impact on the decision-making process when Obama allows or vetoes or accepts certain decisions to attack certain people? And the extensive pressure that's been put on the Pakistan Army as far as North Waziristan is concerned, because we feel it's more like a prison for the militants right now. We can keep an eye on them. Mm-hmm. What if they proliferated throughout the country? That would massively destabilize the country if we went into an operation, for example.
Thank you. There's on a couple points. There is a you're right on the Bin Laden raid. It was this moment where a very proud institution, the Pakistani military, was greatly embarrassed by the fact that, that the U.S. had done this operation on their soil, then got out, and B, that Osama bin Laden had been hiding so close to Pakistan's premier military academy. The relationship, the fact that the relationship has become so toxic has created, I think, in Washington this just sort of fatigue over it. And you bring up North Waziristan, you know, for 3 years or something, you hear the American officials say, well, there's going to be an operation in North Waziristan, and then by last year it's sort of like, well, you know, probably not. And I understand there's actually very real reasons why the Pakistan military might not want to have a large scale military operation in North Waziristan, but it's, you know, it just people have become very cynical. Both sides have become very cynical about each other's motives, and that is, you know, maybe if you look at the history of U.S.-Pakistan relations, and there's plenty of people in this room who know more about it than I do, that there is a, you know, these periods of intense, of this intense embrace, and then we get sick of each other and we cool off in our corners, and so maybe there's a cooling off period that's needed over the next several years.
We're just about out of time. Just to follow up on that in closing, the United States is going to withdraw from Afghanistan. What kind of footprint do you see being left there that will facilitate operations in Pakistan? And from your reporting in Pakistan, you know, what's the perspective there about what Afghanistan without an American or international presence is going to look like for them in terms of their security environment?
I mean, I think that there is a great deal of concern in Pakistan about an Afghanistan being left in total chaos. I mean, there's this view that you know, what the Pakistani government wants is a return of the Taliban to Afghanistan. That's not. I don't at all believe that that's what they want. I think that they think that the Taliban should be part of discussion, should have some role. But I mean, the concern is chaos. So that's why you've seen Pakistan's government, you know, try to play some role in brokering peace negotiations. I do think the U.S. will, you know, they will leave a force in Afghanistan after 2014. I would be incredibly surprised that if the U.S. Did not preserve the option of trying to do drone strikes even after 2014 from bases in Afghanistan. Now, again, the Pakistan's government will have a vote on that. And so what the United States would like to do post-2014 will be, I mean, I think to continue having a presence, but whether Pakistan will allow it and whether the relationship improves at all, I think remains to be seen.
Well, thank you, Mark. Journalism has been called the first cut at history, and this book, The Way of the Knife, is essential reading for informing our public debate about the history that's occurred over the last 10 years, how the institutional evolution kind of was a reflection of how the nature of conflict in this era is so different. And it tells that story, provides that first cut, but also points to the issues and the kind of the persisting policy tensions that the senior officials in this country are going to have to grapple with. And many of these are sort of dilemmas that can't be kind of resolved neatly by an org chart of dividing between functional areas of CIA and the military. Mark, it was a pleasure to have you here in residence. This is a residential program, so we live with the people who come here to write the books, and it was a pleasure to have you as a presence here and to have produced this superb book. Congratulations. Copies of which are available outside the door, and the author will autograph them. So please join me in thanking Mark for this excellent presentation.